Hello my friends, it's the Game Boy Geek here. Today, we go back to the year 54 AD in Rome. After years of scheming, intrigues, marriages, and other convenient deaths, Agrippina the Younger has succeeded in putting her son, Nero Claudius Caesar, on the throne. While she still has her mighty legions, the contested succession is yet another strain on the overextended Roman Empire. Factions throughout the empire see potential openings to regain their freedom. Among them, Jewish priests and zealots posture for open rebellion. Externally, Germanic tribes, Goths, and Parthians can't agree on anything except their hatred for Rome. And an emerging coalition offers them a unique opportunity to push back the frontier of the empire. But a new faction known as Christians is challenging everything about Roman, Jewish, and coalition religious beliefs, and it's expanding door to door, city to city, and region to region. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Soul of the Empire by Chara Games. This is a 2 to 4 player asymmetrical strategy game about life in the 1st century. Players take on the perspective of Romans, Christians, Jews, or an outside coalition in an effort to accomplish their own faction's unique objectives. Mechanically, it uses area control, dice management, and asymmetric faction powers. However, thematically, it explores the tensions between and motivations behind the 4 dominant worldviews of the period. Let me show you how the game works, and I'll see you on the other side. Now this is a Kickstarter preview, so all the components you see here are going to be prototype components, and save for the artwork, it's subject to change, so you'll want to check the Kickstarter link in the description of this video to see all the final assets. In Soul of Empires, you're going to be one of the 4 factions, and each of you will get your own board, like the Roman faction, the Jewish, the Christian, or the coalition. Now these boards are double-sided, have different artwork on each side, and they do include females in a lot of the sides. And here's the alternate sides of each of those boards showing the different artwork. Now here's Soul of the Empire set up for 4 players. Now much of the setup is standardized, but there are some strategic decisions that are made, such as where certain markers go that will influence scoring throughout the game, and then some of the Romans get to go last, but there is some strategy to the setup as well. Now there's 2 different ways to win the game. One of them is to get your faction's point track marker all the way to the 7 on this track. Now here in this prototype, the Romans are these red cubes, the Jewish are these blue towers, the coalition are these green towers, and the Christians are these white markers here. Now in order to move up there, the Romans, Christians, and Jewish can complete different objective cards throughout the game. For example, if the Jewish had 3 Jewish units in each blue territory, well they could get this and get a point. We'll show you how that works later. The coalition works quite differently. We'll go over those later. The other way to win is to use your faction's special victory condition. For the Romans, it's capture 25 enemy units. As you defeat them in combat, you'll be adding them here, and as you capture 25, you'll win as the Romans. Now, as Christians, your special victory is to convert 18 units and have at least 1 unit in each Rome, Germania, and Jerusalem, and you'll be tracking your converted units here as you win combat that we'll talk about. The Jewish special victory is to have sole occupancy, meaning they're the only ones there, of the blue region on the map. And for the coalition, they're trying to have sole occupancy of Rome and Italia. The game is played over multiple rounds. Each round, each player is going to go through 3 phases, and it's going to go to the next player clockwise, and it starts with the Roman player. So at the beginning of each turn, you're going to go through a start phase, and that player is going to possibly do some things that have to do with power cards that may trigger during a start phase, or maybe scoring a claimed objective card. But we're going to jump right into the main phase here. You're going to have some dice that are in this unspent dice area. At the beginning of the game, you're going to get your dice ready. In subsequent rounds, you're going to get them ready at the end of your turn so you can plan while it's other people's turns. And what readying your dice means is, right here you can see we have 2 different sets. Now one set is all the same number, another set is a run, sort of a sequence, 4, 5, 6, and 2 3s there. So how do you ready your dice is you roll them all once, and then you can re-roll any of the dice up to 2 times. So in total, each die can be rolled up to 3 times while you're readying it, sort of like a Yahtzee style thing, where you can re-roll any of them up to 2 more times for a total of 3, and then you're going to create a sequence. So I have 2 sequences I can choose from. 3, 3, or 4, 5, 6. In this case, let's say we're going to use this 4, 5, 6 as our sequence, and depending on the dice, it's going to allow us to do different things with some of the actions. Now with that dice set, we can do any of these actions that we can do with these dice in any order. So for example, let's show you how to recruit units. Recruit units has a number sign, which means the number on the pip matters. So let's say we use the 6. That means we can recruit 6 of these. So I put this in the spent dice area, and I'm going to use 6 to recruit 6 different units. Now I'm going to take those units from my supply and place them. I can place them anywhere I have at least one unit. I could put them all in the same place or scatter them as long as I have one unit there, but I can never put them in places where a coalition is. So if there was a coalition here, I couldn't put it here, but I could put it pretty much anywhere else that I have one. So let's say I'll put one here, one here, one here, one here, one here, and another one right here. So there's my 6 recruit action. Now let's say with my other dice, these are the ones of the set that I'm using, I'm going to move units. And because it has the number sign, it means the number matters. I do the 5 into my spent dice. This gives me 5 points of movement. Now each point of movement is 1 unit either to an adjacent region or moving across dotted lines, the C routes to different areas. So I could go like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, for example. Now you might be wondering what this red line is. This has to do with everything below this this red line is in Roman power, and this will matter later when we talk about the coalition faction. Now let's say we're going to initiate combat. It does have a number sign, so the number doesn't matter. You just use any die from the set that you had used and put in my spent dice, and I'm going to initiate a combat. Now, the person activating that will pick one territory where they have at least 1 unit in it that they want to initiate combat in, and they have to say which of the other factions they are going against. For example, if there was a coalition in here, they would have to say, okay, which one of these places I want to do it here, and I want the combat, I want to say which one I am fighting. I would have to decide. But in this case, it's just a no-brainer. It's the Romans against the Jewish. Now, both of them are going to be selecting a combat card from their hand of cards to play. Now, before that happens, there are some power cards that do different things, and I'll get to these later, but these would get played before combat if wanted. We'll show you how to get to those later, but other than that, we see combat cards, and we see a base value here. The Romans have 3, and the Jewish have 1, simply because of the amount of units that's there. Then normally you would activate the combat cards. Some of them don't have text, some of them do. If they both have text, the attackers goes first, unless the defenders would cancel it. In this case, I'm the attacker, and I would do this. Now, it would cancel all text on my opponent's combat card. Now, the Jewish would have been able to add 1 unit of any faction from an adjacent territory into this combat, but this cancels that. So now we're just down to the numbers, 3 versus 4. So we take the 3 Romans plus the 3, so we're at 6, and this is 4 plus 1 is 5. So the Romans have won 6 to 5. And anytime the Romans, Jews, and or coalition are fighting each other, it's always the highest value wins. We'll get to some other exceptions later. And if there's ever a tie, it goes to the defender. Now when the winners roam, they're going to take all of the units from that faction that they beat in that place and capture it. So even if there were a bunch of them here, they would have taken them all, but there's just 1, so they'll just take this 1. And they would add it to their captured unit area. Remember, trying to get to 25 is one of their win conditions. And the combat card we use goes to a discard pile, and once these combat cards all are here, all 6 of them, then they come back into my hand. Now let's go, we had spent all of the dice here, and we would go to an end phase where we would possibly play power cards that we'll get to in just a moment. We could purchase more power cards, we could roll and ready dice for our next turn, and we could possibly score claimed objective cards, which we did not do. So it would essentially, at this point, we would roll and ready our dice, it would go to the next player's turn. So let's say we've readied our dice, we have 3 4s and a 1 and 2, so we're going to use this as our set for our next turn, and we would be thinking about it during other players' turns, but let's pretend it came back to us to show you what some of these other actions do. So let's say we wanted to buy some of these power cards we've been talking about. Now, when you do this, it has the number and it has a star. Star means you can actually use some of the dice that aren't in your set. So I'm going to put this here because it's a power card dice. I'm going to put it over here. And for every 2 pips, you can get one of these cards, but you don't do it to the end phase. And because it has this star here, it means you can add another die here like this. So now I have a total of 6. Since each of these power cards are 2, then that will allow me to get 3 power cards, and that's going to be the end of the round. I'll do that. So let's put this here now, and let's use another one of these dice to try to claim an objective card. So we're going to put this on the card itself. And I'm going to place it right here on the Roman side. This says remove all the factions units from a region this turn. So in my end phase, if I was able to do this, I would score this card. I would get 1 point on the tracker here like this, and then we would get a new objective would come out here. Now, just because my die here doesn't mean it's definitely mine. Because on the Christian player's turn, if I didn't do this on this turn, they might put a die here and say, hey, have a unit in each territory outside the Roman Empire. And they might be able to do that before I do this, and they would get the card. I would get that dice back for my next turn, but it's sort of a race on some of these cards to get the objective done. And there's also ways to get this die back by paying dice and things like that. Now, it's not usually normally a good idea to do that, but you could spend your last die then to get that other die from the objective card back. If you knew that it was there for a couple rounds and it's not going to happen, you can get that die back for future turns. Now, during the end phase, I'll now purchase the card. So I'll take these 6 pips, and that will get me 3 of these power cards. I take them right off the top of the deck and have them in my hand. You can only have a maximum of 3. If you have more than 3 at this point, you discard down so that you have 3 in your hand. Now these cards do different things and they trigger in different times. So this one will be triggered during your start phase. This one in any 3 of the phases. This one during any combat. Now you can only play one of these throughout your entire turn unless you're attacked and there's one that's specific in combat. You can play that out of turn. But they're usually pretty powerful cards. I'll pause it here. You can just read these if you like, but they do different things throughout the game. Now in that end phase, after possibly playing power cards or purchasing power cards, as we just showed you, you would roll and ready your dice. So you'd take all these spent dice and any dice that you didn't use, and you would roll and ready, as talked about previously, of rolling the dice there up to 3 times to create your different sets. However, then you could score the claim objective card. So that card we just talked about that had a die on it, since we did this, we would be able to score the points here. This would be 1 point. We would move it on that objective score track as shown. Now the die that was on this would then get placed into your spent die area because this is not available until the end of your next turn. And then you'd place this card up here over by your scored objective cards. Now that you know the basics, let me go into a little bit of the specifics of some of the factions to show you some more of the asymmetry of the game. Now you already know that each faction has a different victory condition, but some of them work a little bit differently as well. For example, the Jewish here, they have some of their power cards that have revolts on them, and it brings in a new gray faction where they would get gray markers. Basically here, they'd get to place 5 of those in any coastal territory in the Roman Empire, and essentially these are factions of the Jewish, but they're gray factions to sort of help them out, and they get an extra die that will be used when combat ensues with those revolted gray faction units. And the Jews can use one of their Jewish die to move or combat with the gray faction. They count towards their units, and then the units themselves actually can also count for scoring objective cards, like having certain units and things like that. So it kind of gives them a leg up in a certain way. Now the Christian faction, they start with some underground units. They get 4 of them, they actually go here, but this text tells you what it does. Basically on your turn, you can put any of these, any amount of these, in any blue territory anytime on your turn. It's free and not an action, so it gives them sort of a one-time powerful bonus there. Now the Christians do combat a little bit differently from the others. If the Christians are having combat with the Jewish or the Romans, it's the lowest number wins. So in this case, we have 1 plus 3, so Jewish are at 4, and the Christians are at 2 plus 1 is 3. So 3 to 4, since the Christians have 1 less, they have won this battle. Now they would take the difference of that, since they won, of that faction off the board. Now in this case it was 3 to 4, the difference is only 1, so this 1 unit would be lost. But if the Jewish had 2 here, and this had happened, this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3. Both of them, that's the difference as well. Both of these would have been lost. These get given back to the faction, and the converted units would be going up by that amount, and they're trying to get to 18 to win. And you'd replace the units that you gave back to the faction that you defeated with 2 of your own Christian units. However, if the Christians were battling with the coalition, then it's the highest combat value would win. And speaking of those coalitions, let's talk a little bit about how they change things on the board. Now we mentioned a little bit about this earlier, but if you're moving through a region that has coalition, they're frozen there until all of the coalition have moved or been killed or captured or off the board. So once you have a piece in there, it can no longer be moved. Plus, if you have a piece in with those, you cannot recruit members into there. So it kind of changes the way that you can move around in the map. Now the coalition does battling a little different from the others. They have this thing called the rage track. It starts at 2, and this basically gets added or subtracted, depending on this value, to the current combat. So it's the the amount of units, then the combat cards, some other things power cards can change things, but this is also going to adjust that number. Now if they win, then this is going to go down 1. Also, if they win, they can go down another 1, and plunder. And plunder just does a powerful thing, which means they can move their units in that combat to another territory that's adjacent, or they can steal a power card randomly from that player that they beat, or they could discard a power card from that player that's already in play. Now, if they lose a combat, then this goes up. So this is sort of a different scale. As they lose, it gets more powerful. As they win, it goes down, and they can do some other powerful things there. Now, at the beginning, we talked one of the victory conditions for any of the factions is get to the 7 here, and that the other 3 factions basically can move up that track by getting objectives, but there are no objectives for the coalition, so how do they move up this track? And that's of these objective markers that were somewhat strategically placed a little bit at the beginning of the game from the different factions. So how they score is, let's say they have some people here and they have combat and they end up winning, and this is gone. They have spent a die during their turn. It's an action that only they can take, is place it where one of these markers are, and this die will basically stay there until you score this, or you spend some die to get it back. But at in the end phase, if you have sole occupancy of this area and you had your die that you spent, you get to collect this, and this will get you a point on the track. Now, if you collect a second one of that faction's marker, let's say Rome was here, if you collect a second one, you go up 1 for getting that there. You get a second one for getting the second one of that faction, and then that faction actually goes down 1. So it can be very powerful for the coalition to move up by getting these different markers. Now, another way to get a point for the coalition is to have sole occupancy of every area inside of a region like this. They would get 1 point as just shown, and then they'll take one of these, and I'll place it on my board in just a moment, and then you can consolidate these all into one area if you like. And you place that one that we took off in the spot here for sole occupancy, because you can only do each one of these regions once throughout the game. And another additional action the coalition has is to block an objective card. Let's say we think the Jewish is going to have 3 Jewish units in each blue territory, but they haven't yet claimed this. We could spend any of our dice, whether or not they're in our specific sequence or not, as long as the pips add up to 6. So you could put a single 6 there, or you could put like a 4 and a 2, and it blocks this from the Jewish being able to do this. Now, you can only block each faction once at a time out there, and you can only block each card 1 time. Now, you can move these to another one by using another 6 pips, or you can return the die by, wasting any 1 die to pull those back. Now, for 2 players, the first player would choose either Rome or the coalition. Let's say they pick coalition. Then that second player would get Rome, and then they would have the first selection of the other 2 factions. So let's say they select them, and then the first player would get what's left. And you win by having one of your factions get to their special victory condition, or have that faction get to 7, and then just have the other faction get to 3. And in general, each faction that you're using cannot attack each other, you cannot share combat cards and such, and there's some other rule changes as well. And in a 3-player game, the Roman faction must be used, and then the other 2 players take any of the 2 of the 3 remaining factions. So as you can tell, this is a pretty deep strategy game, and the asymmetry of this game is really what makes it shine. And it's not just how I showed you the different factions, win conditions. So you have the Romans who are trying to capture certain amounts. You have Christians that are trying to convert. You have, the Jews that are trying to, stay powerful in a certain area. Then you have the coalitions that are just trying to be in a specific spot of Rome and Italy there. And not just that, but the fact that you can either try to win on your own victory condition or try to win with the 7-point track, it makes it very interesting because you're always you've got 2 ways to win, but so does everybody. So you're constantly keeping your head on a swivel, looking around, what are other people doing? What are their goals? How close are they? And not only that, but just even the way that they play are different. Like, when the Christians battle the Jews and the Romans, well, it's the lowest combat value. But if they combat against the coalition, then it's the highest. The Jewish can bring in that gray faction with some of those revolt cards. So just different ways to play. The coalition really messes everybody up by recruiting and movement restrictions, and also just the way that they get their points by either controlling everything in a certain province area, or by getting those different objective markers. So there's a lot of different things going on. It makes this game interesting. And so if you're interested in learning more, seeing the final components and art and things like that, I've placed a link in the description of this video, which will bring you right to their Kickstarter project. And I'm sure the people at Chara Games would love your support.